Scandals. We all love a good one, don't we? Well, maybe the people involved don't love them so much, but the public certainly seems to enjoy sinking their teeth into them. The MMA world has offered up plenty of juicy scandals over the years to satiate even the strongest of appetites for destruction. And today we're going to dive into the mud a bit and run down those scandals that rocked the MMA world to its core.
Not quite my tempo.
I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and these are the top 10 scandals in MMA history. Number 10. Worked fights in Japan. Pro wrestling and mixed martial arts have always shared space, but more so than anywhere else, they are fundamentally tied together in Japan. For over 50 years, the strong style of pro wrestling has been prominent in Japan. Bouts were made to look as realistic as possible and featured legitimate techniques and stiff-worked strikes, but usually predetermined finishes. This style made way for shoot bouts like the Antonio Inoki versus Muhammad Ali fight, what many consider one of the first real MMA bouts. In the 80s and 90s, when some major Japanese wrestling promotions decided to adopt a more American style with its outlandish storylines and maneuvers, several prominent pro wrestlers formed organizations like Pancrase and Fighting Network Rings to preserve the Japanese style of wrestling. In the case of Pancrase, the bouts were meant to have legitimate outcomes from inception. Fight Network Rings only transitioned into legitimate competition somewhere in the mid-90s. However, there is some debate about when exactly that transition took place, which is why Japanese MMA having firm roots in the predetermined wrestling world has caused many to question the outcomes of some bouts in those organizations. Guy Metzger said in an interview in 2001 that while he was never asked to work a finish in his 20-plus Pancrase fights, there were some bouts in the organization that did have predetermined outcomes. And of course, you need only watch our top 10 alleged fight fixes video to know that there were more than a few questionable Pride FC bouts. Truth be told, we'll probably never really know the full extent to which fights may or may not have been predetermined in the early days of these organizations in Japan. It might have only been occasionally, it might have been more often, it depends on who you talk to, but JMMA's connections to pro wrestling will always muddy the waters about which fights were legit and which were worked. Number 9. Nick Diaz suspended for 5 years. Our wonderful little sport in the United States is held together by commissions that answer to nobody and can pretty much do whatever it is they want with little to no repercussions. For the most part, these state bodies do a great job, but sometimes they really drop the ball, and in one of the most ludicrous overreaches of their powers, in September of 2015, Nick Diaz was suspended for 5 years and fined $165,000 for having a marijuana metabolite in his system at UFC 183. 5 years for a metabolite of a drug that would sooner make you watch Scooby-Doo for 6 hours straight than help you when locked in a cage with someone who is planning to do serious harm to your body.
Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell.
Now granted, this was the third such offense for Nick. In 2007, he failed for marijuana after fighting Gomi, and that bout was ruled a no contest. He was suspended 6 months and fined $3,000. And after his 2012 UFC 143 fight with Carlos Condit, Diaz failed again for, you guessed it, pot, and was suspended for a year and fined 30% of his purse. I'm assuming it was not ruled a no contest since he lost. Diaz 125. But again, we are talking about marijuana here, not steroids, as Nick so famously pointed out after the 5-year ban was brought down on him. Nick appealed the ridiculous suspension and fine for the sake of all mankind, and about a year later, the commission came to their senses and reduced the suspension to 18 months and the fine to $100,000, which to be honest is still insane, but I guess it's better than 5 years. Unfortunately for Nick, since he still owed NSAC money, he was not allowed to corner his brother Nate in his 2 Conor McGregor fights. This entire situation was just ridiculous. Number 8. Elite XC's implosion. Our next entry gave us one of the greatest Dana White quotables of all time, so it can't really be that bad. In October of 2008, Kimbo Slice was a rocket ship, and Elite XC had tied themselves to his back on their way to network television superstardom. Slice was set to take on Ken Shamrock in the main event of Elite XC Heat, which was to air on CBS. Unfortunately, Shamrock had to pull out of the fight the day of, and a late replacement was brought in from the undercard, Seth Petrozelli. Petrozelli KO'd Slice in 14 seconds. This was already a massive disaster for Elite XC, as they had put all their eggs in the Kimbo Slice basket, but things got even worse when a week after the fight, Petrozelli said in an interview that the promoter hinted to him and gave him money to stand and throw with Slice instead of taking him down. Uh-oh, the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation thinks that sounds a bit—
that's fucking illegal.
Time to investigate.
Let's have a scene with the bobbies.
Petrozelli quickly went back on his statements, saying that he meant they offered performance bonuses, and he wanted to win one so he kept the fight standing. The investigative wheels were already in motion though at that point, and 16 days after Kimbo got KO'd, parent company Pro Elite announced that they were closing up shop due to debt and a lack of investment interest. I bet. Ironically, 3 days after the announcement that they were closing up shop, the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation ended their investigation, concluding that there was no attempt to fix the fight. A consultant for the company, though, TJ Thompson, told SureDog that same week he had no proof, but he would be amazed if Petrozelli wasn't paid to keep the fight standing. Number 7. Brock Lesnar and UFC 200. Before Brock Lesnar was even announced to be on the UFC 200 card,
Can you see me now? Can you see me now?
there was a mini scandal related to his inclusion. Ariel Helwani broke the news while at UFC 199 that Lesnar would be fighting on the 200 card before the UFC could make their official announcement. This caused considerable tension between the two parties, ending in Helwani and his crew being escorted out of the building and banned from UFC events for life.
Dana was standing in the back there and said, get out of here. You're done. You're not welcome here. He said, go to Bellator, go cover Bellator.
Life being 2 days, they worked it all out.
Who the fuck is Ariel Helwani?
But now that it was official that Lesnar was on the 200 card, a second mini scandal ensued because Lesnar was given an exemption as it related to the UFC's policy about returning fighters needing to be in the USADA testing pool for 4 months before they could compete. Part 3 of the Lesnar UFC 200 scandal hit a week after the event when it was announced that Lesnar failed an out-of-competition test by USADA on June 28th. The bout was overturned to a no contest. Lesnar retired and went back to pro wrestling after he was suspended and fined $250,000 for the failure, money that he still has not paid, by the way. Mark Hunt attempted to sue Lesnar, the UFC, and Dana White, but most all of his claims were dismissed entirely by the courts, and UFC 200 did over 1 million pay-per-view buys, so I suppose all's well that ends well, right? No! Number 6. The CONOR and Khabib incidents. Sometimes scandal is great for business, as this next entry proves. I suppose the last entry proved that as well. To really get to the roots of the silliness that I'm about to discuss, we must go back to Khabib Nurmagomedov's post-fight interview at UFC 205, where he called Conor McGregor a chicken.
I wanna fight with your chicken because this is #1 easy fight in lightweight division.
Believe it or not, that one insult would set into motion a series of events that would end with a massive brawl at UFC 229. 2 years after the chicken remark, McGregor teammate Artem Lobov was asked by a Russian journalist what he thought of Khabib's insult. Artem felt that Conor could not be a chicken because he never pulls out of fights, but Khabib does. Cut to Fight Week UFC 223 in April of 2018, and a video emerges of Khabib Nurmagomedov having a not-so-friendly word with Artem Lobov about that interview. This prompts Conor to hop on a plane with his crew to confront Khabib, but when he gets to the Barclays Center on media day, he's too late and the fighters are leaving on a bus. The solution? Attack the bus. Conor and company launched a full-on assault on the UFC bus, culminating in McGregor throwing a dolly that busted a window. As a result of the attack, Conor was arrested, Artem was removed from the event, Mike Chiesa and Ray Borg suffered injuries and were unable to fight. It was a big, stupid disaster. Conor pled no contest in court and had to do some community service, but a fight between McGregor and Nurmagomedov was now white hot. So of course at UFC 229, the two would finally get their hands on each other. That was of course after a heated week of press conferences where Conor laid into the lightweight champion. After the bout was complete and Nurmagomedov had won via submission, he immediately jumped the cage to attack Conor's team.
And now Khabib jumps the fence. Whoa! And he's going right at Dylan Dennis.
Khabib's teammates hopped into the cage and a second brawl ensued between them and Conor. Security got everything under control pretty quickly, and really nothing of note happened besides this just being silly all around. Both fighters ended up with suspensions they are still serving, but the event broke the all-time UFC pay-per-view record, and I'm sure the rematch will do just as well. Number 5. Wandy runs from INSAC. Wanderlei Silva found himself in a difficult position in May of 2014. The Nevada State Athletic Commission wanted to randomly drug test him, and apparently Wanderlei did not want to be randomly drug tested because he claimed he was using banned diuretics for inflammation. So he left. He left the gym. He bailed on the test.
But I could run like the wind blows.
The consequence for this action? Well, in September, INSAC fined Wandy $70,000 and banned him from competition for life. Whoa, that got serious pretty fast. Wandy appealed the decision, and a year later, a judge ruled that INSAC had gone too far and they couldn't ban him for life. He would have to have a rehearing and a new punishment be enacted. In 2016, the commission removed the $70K fine and gave Wandy a 3-year suspension instead. Now, this is already fairly scandalous, as one of the most legendary fighters in the sport's history ran from a drug test, but where Wandy really takes this to the next level is that during the time of his suspension, it was announced that he would be competing in Rizin. Now, the proposed bouts never came came together, but the plan was to basically defy the commission and just go fight somewhere that doesn't really care about those rules, like Japan. The UFC had a tiny issue with that, considering he was, under contract with their organization. Wandy lashed out at the UFC, accusing them of fight fixing, and believe it or not, this somehow all got resolved with Wandy retracting his statements and the UFC releasing him from his contract so he could go fight against the commission's wishes, apparently. Now, these fights in Japan never materialized, but since then, other fighters have actually done exactly that. Number 4. Jon Jones everything. The bizarre list of Jon Jones scandals is almost laughable. We're honestly close to being able to just make a top 10 Jon Jones scandals video. But since we don't have that kind of time today, I'll just give you the cliff notes. Incident number 1, a month after his third title defense against Rashad Evans, Jon slammed his Bentley into a telephone pole and then pled guilty to driving under the influence. Months later, Bones would refuse to fight last-second replacement Chael Sonnen, and the event was canceled. A few years later, after some screenshots emerged of Jones using homophobic slurs towards an Alexander Gustafsson fan on social media, the champ claimed his account was hacked and his phone was stolen. A few months after that, Jones and Daniel Cormier got into a little fist fight at a press event for UFC 178. In 2015, INSAC revealed that Jones had tested positive for a cocaine metabolite, even though the test was out of competition and therefore not a violation. Jones went to rehab for literally a day. In April, Jones crashed into a pregnant woman and then fled the scene until later surrendering to police. Jones was stripped of his light heavyweight title, received probation, and had to speak at 72 different schools to teach kids not to be Jon Jones. Jones then ruined UFC 200's main event by failing a pre-fight drug test 3 days before the event. He was then stripped again. After he returned a year later, he would win the light heavyweight title from Daniel Cormier at UFC 214, only to have the title stripped from him a third time due to a positive test for a turinabol metabolite, which led to another suspension. Upon returning to competition nearly 2 years later, a long-term turinabol metabolite was found in Jones' system prior to his scheduled title fight with Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 232, which was not considered a re-ingestion, but a remnant of the previous failure, so the event was moved on days' notice from Nevada, who refused to license Jones to California. Oh, also he pokes people in the eye sometimes. Number 3. Testosterone replacement therapy. What if fighters didn't have to dope? What if they could just do it by a different name and everything was totally okay? Well, such was the case when for a period of time around the mid-2000s to 2014, testosterone replacement therapy was the loophole of all loopholes in mixed martial arts. How did it work? Simply get a doctor to diagnose you with low testosterone, and you would likely be granted a therapeutic use exemption for TRT by whatever commission was sanctioning your fight. And that's it.
There you are.
You were good to go. Suddenly, old fighters seemed young again, and mid-20s Todd Duffy finally looked as much like the Hulk as he always had. But TRT was not long for this world. 35-year-old Vitor Belfort went on an ungodly run of TRT-induced destruction, looking better than he did in his prime. But the alarm at Vitor murdering middleweights and the increased use and, in December, abuse by Bigfoot Silva of the TRT system — Silva was suspended for elevated testosterone levels beyond what his exemption allowed him — the Nevada State Athletic Commission had had enough. TRT was banned outright in February of 2014. Vitor would then pull out of his scheduled title fight at UFC 173 as a result, and when he finally did get that shot at Chris Weidman in May of the next year, he looked like a different person and lost via first-round TKO. Number 2. The MMA Dictator. MMA often makes for some strange bedfellows, and probably no stranger or more scandalous than Ramzan Kadyrov. Kadyrov is the head of the Chechen Republic and has been under fire from human rights organizations the world over for violations that have taken place since he took power. Torture, murder, political assassinations, disappearances, an anti-gay purge, you name it, and he has been accused of doing it by watch groups. In his spare time, Kadyrov is a massive MMA fan who has his own state-run gym and promotion, Akhmat Fight Club. In 2016, Ramzan held a show that included children under 12 fighting without protective gear, with one bout ending via TKO. But his presence in the MMA world is not exclusive to Russia. In addition to several fighters from his gyms making it into the UFC, the dictator loves to be seen having ties to UFC fighters like Frankie Edgar, Frank Mir, Fabricio Verdum, Chris Weidman, and Khabib Nurmagomedov. He even sat cage side for the UFC's first card in Russia. As his influence in the fight community grows, I have no doubt that this entry will not be comprehensive as it relates to his concerning ties to mixed martial arts. Number 1. The Yakuza and Pride. Many will tell you that the Yakuza have their hand in damn near all entertainment in Japan, but the Yakuza's ties to Pride Fighting Championship are a considerable amount more than just paying some protection money to the mob. Founded in 1997, Pride was funded and created by gangster-turned-celebrity gangster Hiromichi Momose and mob-fronted KRS promoter Nobuyuki Sakakibara, with Naoto Morishita eventually taking the role of president of the parent company to Pride, Dream Stage Entertainment. Allegedly, various Yakuza factions were putting huge money into the promotion, as well as buying large numbers of tickets to events. That was until President Morishita committed suicide in 2003 under strange circumstances, cases, some believed to actually be a Yakuza hit. According to former Fedor Emelianenko manager Miro Mijatovic, a power struggle then began between two rival Yakuza factions, ending in one group taking control and placing Sakakibara as the president. Stories of fight fixes, fighters being paid with duffel bags of cash, Dana White being personally threatened after purchasing Pride, managers being held in hotels for days at gunpoint until they gave up their clients' contracts, and so much more are widespread and ultimately too numerous to mention fully in just this single entry. But it was the organization's ties to the Yakuza that would ultimately be their downfall. Under increasing pressure from Japanese publications exposing the ties Pride FC had to organized crime, the Fuji network terminated their contract with DSE to air Pride events on national television in Japan. And that was the death blow. Less than a year later, Pride had been bought by Zuffa and the rest is history. But the fact that this scandal literally brought down one of the most powerful organizations in all of mixed martial arts has to place this entry at number 1. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe. We've got 3 new videos or more for you every single week. Follow On Point MMA on Twitter and have yourself a wonderful day. To interact with an engaged live crowd. Sometimes this doesn't go as planned.
You guys, you better not boo me. I for my off. You.
Sometimes we get generic answers.
Get my shot.
But when it fires on all cylinders, a post-fight speech can end up being a defining moment in their career and live on beyond their time as an active fighter. Today we're going to put an